My name is Jonathan, and I'm going to share a particularly difficult time and the feelings that I was feeling at that time. When I was growing up, I was very, very, very troubled, and I didn't really know why. Excuse me. Um, but I lived tremendously in my head, and my head was full of anxiety, and my anxiety oft centered around fears of hurting other people unintentionally, and causing suffering and pain to other people. And my preoccupation with this was obsessive. Um, really not a day went by, not an hour went by that some large part of that hour was not preoccupied with ruminating about some way that I might potentially harm someone, and I just felt so much guilt and shame and fear all the time. And this went on for years and years and years, and I really had nothing to compare it to, so I just thought that that was life, and I was just a sort of tortured, thoughtful freak. But it was very disturbing, and I had to develop kind of strategies to manage this tremendous anxiety I felt. And so I would do things like repeat mantras and clap my hands in certain ways when I was speaking the mantras, and pinching myself, and all these sorts of things to kind of like reinforce what I was saying, or what I knew to be true but was afraid might not be true and was doubting. The classic one would be like, is the gas on the stove on? We all have those feelings, and we all sometimes check the gas to make sure that the stove is off. But in my case, I would do it over and over and over and over again. And as soon as I was sure that the gas was off and I would walk out of the room, immediately the thought was, well, maybe I bumped into the gas on the way out with my, shirt or something, and hit it and didn't realize it, and I'm going to kill my whole family in the middle of the night because we're all going to die of gas. I wasn't really worried about myself, I was worried about other people. There were so many irrational, obsessive fears, and it was terrifying. But it was my life, it was what I knew, and so I found ways. I was incredibly resilient, and I found ways of functioning, even though my grades were horribly erratic, and my moods were extreme, and I had to take, 2 showers at least a day that would last like 45 minutes long. But I managed it. As I got a little bit older, in my late teens, I managed it somehow better than I had before. It wasn't that my life was easier, or I was in less confusion and pain and anxiety, but I just sort of found a way to integrate it and to function. But one day, I was driving around in my car, and I was heading home, and as I was driving, a raccoon ran out in front of the car, and I hit it. And it's always disturbing and horrible hitting an animal. And for me, particularly, who was obsessed with causing no harm, it was really disturbing. But the worst part of it was that the animal didn't die. And I saw it, I stopped my car, and I saw it in the rearview mirror, kind of crawling across the road, horribly injured. And when I was looking at it, for some reason, a brief fleeting thought popped into my head. At first, it was just a thought of association, and I thought, wow, that raccoon looks like a person. And then the next thought was, maybe it was a person. And I thought, suddenly there was a spike of anxiety, and I thought, it's not a person, it's a raccoon. Look, I can see it's a raccoon. And then I drove away. As soon as I got out of visual distance of the raccoon, the thought occurred to me again, what if I just hit a person and I just left them there on the road? And I was like, Jonathan, that's crazy. It was a raccoon. But nothing in my brain could give me the closure to know it, even though I knew it. It was an irrational doubt that could not be quashed. I knew it was irrational, but I still couldn't resolve the anxiety. So I turned around and I went back and I looked, and there was the raccoon again, crawling tragically off the road. This poor dying animal, and that was traumatic again to see. But again, I was like, it was a raccoon, and I turned around and left. Unfortunately, I could not get this out of my head, and every time I left, I had a tiny bit of doubt that I had just hit a person. And every time I had to go back to assure myself that it wasn't. Every time I went back, it was so depressing and horrible, but also confirmation. But as soon as I wasn't looking at it, the feeling of relief at knowing that I didn't hit a person was gone. And I snapped. I completely snapped. It was just this hyper escalation of the kinds of feelings that I had experienced my whole life, but this one was much more extreme. And this one was happening after a relatively long period of feeling that I was managing the symptoms. And I suddenly became terrified that I was losing my mind and that I was gone, like I was never going to be back. I thought I was going crazy. My mind was racing. It was excruciating. And I couldn't get it out of my head, and I didn't know what to do. The only thing that I could think to do was to try to just say something over and over again, which is kind of related to my mantras that I would do, just to stop my brain from fixating on the fear that I had just hit a person, even though I hadn't. And so I started making, the only thing that could come to me in this state of anxiety was like animal sounds. So I started to make animal sounds. And it sounds funny now, but at the time it was terrifying because I was sitting in my car, trying to go home, knowing that I didn't hit a person, but feeling like I had just hit a person, and barking and meowing and doing all this stuff. I didn't think I was an animal. It wasn't like, the depictions you see of someone who is, quote unquote crazy, who thinks they're an animal. I just couldn't stop my mind from racing, and that's all I could think to do to make it stop. The worst part is that as I drove home, I passed a person walking on the road, and in this heightened, hyper anxious state, and the paranoid fear that I had just hit a person, I saw that person and I thought, God, look how easy. I could just have accidentally swerved or not be paying attention, and I could hit that person and kill them. Oh my God, like the understanding that I had that kind of power and the ability to cause that much harm without any intention or even thinking about it was so overwhelming and terrifying to me. And then I literally snapped, and I had a psychotic break, and I heard a voice as I was contemplating this and looking at the person as I drove past them. The voice said, and I was like, oh my God, I don't want to hit that person. And the voice said, do it, in this kind of like demonic voice. And I was like, Wah! Barking, meowing, racing home. I come running in the front door, and my mother encounters me in this condition, and she just immediately starts crying. She doesn't know what's going on. She's terrified, and I'm trying to explain that I'm not crazy. I'm just telling her the whole narrative, but it doesn't make any sense to her. And she called my therapist, who I had been going to for some time because I was so troubled. And my therapist suggested that she take me to the emergency room, psychiatric emergency room, and she did. And when I got there, I was freaking out, and they gave me something to relax a little bit. Eventually, I saw a doctor, and I talked to him for not even 5 minutes, and he said to me at one point, and so how long have you had obsessive compulsive disorder? And I was like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And he for the first time in my life, someone actually named this thing that had literally plagued my childhood and kind of, frankly, destroyed my childhood in a lot of ways. Um, he told me that I had obsessive compulsive disorder, that my psychotic break was not serious, it was the result of extreme stress, and that there was medication I could take and that I needed to be in the hospital for a little while. And I remember feeling fear, but I was so grateful to have a name for it. And he gave me this book called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing, and he opened it up and handed me it and showed me this page, and it was a page about people who were obsessing that they had hit someone with a car and had to keep going back over and over and over again. And for the first time, what seemed like my perverse, deranged, insane, twisted mind suddenly was just a thing that afflicted a number of people. And I didn't feel great upon hearing that, but I suddenly didn't feel so crazy. I didn't feel so shameful. I didn't feel so lost. And I did. I felt a little hopeful that these people could help me and that I wasn't going to be tortured for the rest of my life. And I really, because that's what I felt, my life was just going to be an endless stream of anxiety and torture and fear and rituals and everything. And suddenly, as soon as I started reading my book, I realized all the behaviors that I had exhibited earlier on were just textbook behaviors, and that's what obsessive compulsive disorder was. It was sort of not being able to resolve a doubt or a fear or a thought that occurred to you that normally would just breeze through someone's mind for a fraction of a second and then move on. For whatever reason, my brain was not able to, it was able to intellectually know that that was a meaningless thing, but it couldn't resolve it as a normal brain could. So I had to live in this kind of dual world of like, I know this not to be true, but I still can't believe it's not true. And it. I went on medication. I got a lot of therapy, but that feeling of relief that I felt, my life continued to get crazy, and it took a long time for my life to get better, but that was definitely one of the most important moments in my life, to have this thing that had so dominated my life be named, and to be shown that I wasn't quote unquote crazy, that I just had a specific, quantifiable, clinical disorder that could be managed in different ways, was a huge relief. And the damage was done, and the trauma of living that way for so long took a very long time to resolve. But I look at that moment as such a crucial turning point. And he just said it casually, how long have you had OCD? And I, suddenly my reality was transformed. I resented my therapist a lot, who had never diagnosed me as such. And it took a long time to forgive her because she should have known. I resented my parents a lot because they were confronted with this behavior and didn't really know what to do with it. And it just, for some reason, never occurred to them until I was a teenager to get me into therapy. But at this point, I realized everyone did the best that they could. I also concealed a lot of my behavior because I knew it was totally crazy and irrational. But I continue to have OCD. I will always have OCD. At different times in my life, it can come back really kind of aggressively and really disrupt my reality. But I have the ability to live with it, and I have the ability to understand it, And I have the ability at least not to feel the absolute terror that I would feel when I was younger, when I didn't understand what was actually going on.
That was amazing. That's exactly like what I wanted. Like, imagine someone who has OCD and they hear that, like, that's perfect.